So today we shall deal with the DSM 5. Yesterday we started with the DSM. We have introduced DSM. Today we will talk more about it. What is this DSM? Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder. Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder. Mental disorders. So this is what we call as DSM. It is basically a manual published by American Psychological Association. That is the association which gives us the criteria to evaluate, to treat and to classify all the mental disorders. That is called American Psychological Association. In short, they call it APA. APA, American Psychological Association. APA. So it is the association which is responsible for classifying, for making an assessment and then proposing some treatment for psychiatric disorders. So the main work of the APA is to provide evidence-based recommendations. This APA association, American Psychological Association, provides evidence-based recommendation for the assessment and treatment of the disorders. So this is the association which is responsible for providing evidence-based recommendations. It's a scientific recommendations. So they provide recommendations with evidence. So all the recommendations that are proposed by American Psychological Association are evidence-based. So they are responsible for providing evidence-based recommendations for the assessment and treatment of the mental disorders. So they provide evidence-based recommendations. They provide evidence-based recommendation for the assessment and treatment. For the assessment and treatment. So that is their main task. So there are lakhs of members who are part of this American Psychological Association who work regularly, make a lot of research, and then they provide evidence-based recommendation for the assessment and treatment of all the psychiatric disorders or mental disorders, mental illness. So this American Psychological Association was founded in the year 1892. This APA was founded in the year 1892. In the month of July 1892. So that is the day of foundation of American Psychological Association, and its first president was Stanley Hall. G. Stanley Hall was its first president. It is founded in America, Washington, D.C. Stanley Hall, G. Stanley Hall. Was its first president of the American Psychological Association. And there are about 1,20,000 members at present. 1,20,000 members are part of this American Psychological Association. And its current president is Sandra Shalman. Sandra L. Salman is the current president of APA, American Psychological Association. So it is the American Psychological Association who have come up with this manual called Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM. It's a very important manual. It is almost like the sacred scripture of psychology. Like every religion has got its own sacred book, sacred scripture. For psychology as a science has got this DSM as the sacred scripture. For any reference, for any clarification, they always go back to this DSM. And DSM has taken different stages. It has evolved over the years. So the very first edition was published in the year 1952. So after the foundation, many years they have been working together because APA was founded in the year 1892. The first edition of DSM has come out in the year 1952. So DSM 1. DSM 1 was in the year 1952. That is the first edition. And slowly it began to evolve based on the research. So all the psychologists, psychiatrists working together, making several research in this field of psychology, and they have come up with this manual called Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And then there came up the second edition in the year 1968, DSM 2. So 1968 we had the second edition. 1980 the third edition was published. 1980 was the publication of the third edition. Then in the year 1987, the third edition was revised. It is called third edition revised, 1982. It's 1987. Third edition was revised in the year 1987. After 7 years of experiment, they keep on making some modifications, changes. And in the year 1994, the fourth edition has come up. DSM 4. (1994). It is one of the important editions. It was used for a long time. This DSM 4. And then 6 years later, in the year 2000, this fourth edition was revised. DSM 4 TR. It is called TR, means text revision. Here it is called only R, just revision. Whereas DSM 4 TR, text revision. The text was revised. That was in the year 2000. And it was used for 13 years, this edition. DSM-4 TR, text revision. TR stands for text revision. It was widely used. DSM-4 and DSM-4 text revision was widely accepted and used. And in the year 2013, they have released the latest edition called DSM-5. That is the latest one we have, DSM-5. And it is given a normal number. This we have changed. So far they are giving Roman numbers. And now they have given a normal number 5, DSM-5, 2013. So it is for the last 7 years we have been using this. They have simplified, they have a lot of modifications are there, adapting from this DSM-4 text revision. So this is the brief history of this DSM and American Psychological Association. And what is their role? Role of the American Psychological Association is to provide evidence-based recommendation for the assessment and the treatment of the mental disorders. And they make use of this manual called DSM. It has taken several revisions have been there, starting from the year 1952. Then we had 1968, the second volume. The DSM third was published in the year 1980. Then the same text was revised in the year 1987. DSM-4 was published in the year 1994. And in the year 2000, we had the text revision of the DSM-4. And finally, in the year 2013, the recent one, the DSM-5 was published. And what is this DSM? Let us look briefly. The scope of DSM is the classification of the mental disorders. That is the main scope of DSM. The classification of mental disorders using a common language and standard criteria. So the DSM gives us the classification of mental disorders using a common language and standard criteria. So psychologists all over the world follow the same manual. And it mainly contains description, symptom and treatment for the mental disorders. DSM contains description of the sickness, the symptoms of the sickness, diagnosis and then treatment. So psychologists and psychiatrists all over the world, they refer to this particular manual in order to diagnose a mental sickness, to classify a mental sickness, to find out the symptoms related to the particular mental disorder or mental illness, and they also make use of the same manual for treatment of the mental sickness. Then DSM-5 has got 3 sections basically. It is the latest edition. So we will be using mainly these two now for our reference. DSM-4 text revision and then DSM-5. So we shall see what are the differences. Now these two editions are complementing each other. Okay. So coming to the DSM-5 2013 edition, there are basically 3 sections. DSM-5 sections of the manual. There are basically 3 sections. First, section 1 deals with the introduction and information. Section 1 deals with introduction and information. Then section 2 deals with criteria and codes. Criteria and codes. And the section 3 deals with measures and models. Section 3 deals with measures and models. Measures and models. So easy for you to remember also. So IICCMM for you to remember. What is the purpose of this DSM-5? Basically there are 3 sections. Section 1 deals with introduction and information. Section 2 deals with criteria and codes. Section 3 deals with measures and models. The first section, introduction and information on how to use this manual. Section 1 deals about, gives introduction, gives information on how to use this manual called DSM. So if you go through section 1, you will know the usage of the manual. It's a kind of introduction, and it also gives us information on how to make use of this manual. Then section 2 deals with diagnostic criteria and codes. How to diagnose a particular mental sickness or mental disorder or psychiatric disorders. So it deals with the diagnostic criteria and diagnostic codes. So section 2 basically helps us to make a diagnosis of mental sickness, mental disorder or psychiatric disorders. Then section 3 deals with emerging measures and models. What are the emerging measures and models? And what are the conditions necessary for further research? Because psychological research never ends. The psychologists all over the world, they keep on working, making further research. So section 3 provides us the emerging measures, emerging models. It provides us the conditions which are required for further research in the field of psychiatry or psychology in terms of dealing with mental disorders. And it also provides a glossary. Glossary means various technical terms which are used in the field of psychiatry to deal with the psychiatric sicknesses. It's called glossary, technical terms. So the section 3 provides also glossary. Glossary, double S. And it also provides cultural concepts in the field of psychiatry, cultural concepts. So this is basically DSM-5. There are basically 3 sections. First section dealing with introduction and information on the usage of the manual. Second section dealing with the diagnostic criteria and codes. Third section, we have emerging measures and models, the conditions required for further research, a glossary, and then cultural concepts. And DSM-5 ends with appendix. There is some useful information provided at the end of the manual. There is also appendix towards the end. So all the psychologists, psychiatrists, all those working in the field of dealing with the mental health professionals, they all consult this particular manual. If you go to any psychiatric lab, you might find this in the reference section. It will be there. Because they always consult this manual. Because there are lots of mental sickness, and based on the research it keeps on changing. So they also update themselves, all the psychologists and psychiatrists, in order to deal with the mental health. Now we are still in the defining the abnormal behavior. We have been defining, we have used three basic models to define abnormal behavior. Deviation from the social norms, deviation from the adequate or normal functioning, and deviation from adequate or ideal mental health. So these are the three basic models we have used. So now DSM-5 comes up with its own model. It is a very important one that we have seen in general. Now DSM-5 also provides 4 criteria for identifying abnormal behavior in the human persons, and they simplify it with 4 Ds. According to DSM-5, there are 4 D criteria to be applied in order to diagnose the abnormal behavior. So what is this 4D? The first D is already we have seen, which was also there. Deviance, distress, dysfunction, and danger. So 4D criteria provided by DSM-5 to diagnose the persons as having mental sickness or mental disorders or psychiatric disorders. So the 4D formula, a 4D criteria proposed by DSM-5. So we have deviance, distress, dysfunction, and danger. The person has to meet all the 4 Ds criteria in order to be diagnosed as a person with abnormal behavior. Usually they have to meet all the 4 Ds. The first one, 4 Ds. 4D criteria. 4D criteria proposed by DSM-5. First one is deviance. The second one is distress. The third criteria is dysfunction. The fourth one is danger. It's called 4D criteria proposed by DSM-5. So we shall look at them, each of them briefly. We have already seen about deviance. No? Any behavior which deviates from the established norm of the society may be considered as the abnormal behavior. The same idea applies here. So deviant behavior, it means different behavior, divergent behavior, extreme, unusual, and bizarre. These are the terms used. Different, divergent, extreme, unusual, and bizarre. So deviance. When a behavior is very different from the normal behavior, very divergent means deviating from the established norm, extreme, any extreme is dangerous, and unusual behavior. We gave a lot of examples, gender-based, age-based, culture-based. We gave several examples the other day. The same thing applies. Anything that goes or deviates from the established norms can be considered as abnormal. It is also unusual or bizarre, very awkward or weird behavior. For example, rape, which is not a normal behavior. A murder or theft, attack, anything that you see in the society, any violence that takes place that deviates from the established norm of the normal behavior, that can be considered as abnormal behavior. So robbery, theft, rape, all the criminal acts, child abuse, murders, They all come under this category of deviant behavior. So basically we thought about three faculties, no, of mind, heart and the behavior. Our mind are the thoughts, emotions and behaviors. Our thoughts, feelings and actions. Thoughts, sentiments and attitudes. So three realms that we talked about. So thoughts, emotions and behaviors which are highly unusual or uncommon, that deviate from the socially established norms, and that becomes deviant behavior or abnormal behavior. So this first criteria is we have already seen, but it is also again proposed by DSM-5. And every culture has got its own standards and norms, or we call them as benchmarks, yardsticks, or particular measures which are acceptable for that particular culture. And any person violating these established standards or norms or measures, that person can be considered or may be considered as the person with abnormal behavior. And then we come to the second criteria proposed by DSM-5, that is distress. What is this distress? It's an unpleasant feeling or upsetting behavior of the individual. Unpleasant feeling and upsetting behavior of the individual. When we say person is in distress, that means the person is not feeling comfortable within himself. That is called distress. It's an unpleasant feeling and upsetting behavior of the person. When we talk about this distress, we are mainly referring to the person's subjective feelings. What are the person's subjective feeling which makes that person to feel uncomfortable or ill at ease? For example, pain, anxiety, depression, agitation, or loss of sleep, loss of appetite, and numerous aches and pains within. So they all can be considered as subjective feelings of the individual person, or unpleasant subjective feelings of the individual persons. All these examples, pain, anxiety, depression, agitation, loss of sleep, loss of appetite, mainly these two. It's a very common unpleasant feelings of the person. When the person loses sleep, or when the person loses appetite, if he is not able to sleep well, if the person is not able to eat well, then the person will be in distress. That may be related to some kind of abnormality. There are some sleep disorders. There are some eating disorders. The other day we have referred to some anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating. They all are related to eating disorders. And there are some sleeping disorders. For example, insomnia. People not able to fall asleep, or their sleep patterns are disturbed. The normal pattern is to sleep at night and to do the work during the day. But the persons who are struggling or who are having kind of mental disturbance or mental sickness or disorders, they will have tough time falling asleep at night. They cannot sleep. And then during the day they may be sleeping, which is unusual. The sleep-wake cycle is disturbed in the person, whereas a normal person sleeps during the night and then she works during the day. But this person, they have a kind of reversed order, or their sleep-wake cycle is totally disturbed. They may sleep only few hours and then they will be awake whole night. Next day they will not be able to function normally. So that will affect their normal rhythm of life. And the person will have this experience of distress. As a result of this lack of sleep or lack of appetite, not able to eat properly, there will be a lot of agitation. The person even may get into depression. There will be a lot of anxiety, a lot of pain inside, a lot of nervousness. So all these feelings will be the subjective feelings of the person. So when the person goes to a psychiatrist, these questions will be asked in order to make a diagnosis. What are the feelings? What are the things that the person undergoes? And then based on that, they may be able to diagnose what kind of sickness it is, or what kind of mental sickness that the person is suffering from. On the other hand, most of the people who are diagnosed with a mental disorder feel entirely miserable inside, but they may appear to be normal to the observer. That is also there. The person may be struggling a lot deep down, but outside it looks like a normal person. That's why we call it as subjective. Distress refers to subjective feelings of the person. May not be an objective feeling. For I did not sleep last night properly, but still I may be teaching well, because I am not showing my tiredness or my fatigue to the people outside. So I may be struggling inside, but to the observer, to the outsider, I may look like a normal person. So that's why it is called subjective feeling of the individual person. That is the second criteria, distress. The person who is deviant expresses or shows deviant behavior, or the person who struggles deep down with all these negative feelings, they can be considered as persons with abnormal behavior. And this distress mainly presents two kinds of pain. One is physical pain, the other one is psychological pain. So these two pains are seen in this person. Physical pain, psychological pain. So when the body is affected, naturally mind also will be affected. And when the mind is affected, naturally it will affect our body. So they are related to each other. That's why it is body-mind coordination. There is a physical pain, and there is a psychological pain. When I don't sleep well, my body gets affected, naturally my mind also gets affected. So I have a physical trauma as well as psychological trauma. I have a bodily problem as well as I have mental problems. So both are related to this distress, and mainly they are experienced by the person himself. It's a subjective feeling of the person. Sometimes it may be appear to be normal to the others, but the person will be struggling inside because of the physical pain and because of the psychological pain. But only this alone is not sufficient to diagnose a person as an abnormal person. We also need the other criteria. So it has to meet basically all the 4 Ds. So the psychiatrists or the psychologists are very careful in terms of determining or classifying or diagnosing a person with a mental disorder. Basically they are to meet these 4 criteria. Even these 4 are not sufficient. Sometimes person may be having all these 4, still we cannot consider that person as abnormal. So it is very delicate to diagnose a person as person with abnormal behavior. And this brings us to the third criteria proposed by DSM-4, DSM-5, that is dysfunctional. What is this dysfunctional? Means disruptive behavior. Dysfunction refers to disruptive. 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 That means it diminishes one's well-being. It reduces the well-being of the person. It affects the well-being of the person. Anything that happens to the person which reduces or which interferes in the well-being and the goodness of the person can become dysfunctional or disruptive, because it affects the normal functioning of the person. It's called disruptive. Disruptive. It diminishes the well-being of the person. It diminishes. Because it is disruptive, it diminishes the well-being of the person. And it interferes with the daily functioning of the person. It disrupts, diminishes, and interferes. Interferes. A dysfunctional person cannot fit into the society, because this dysfunctional behavior of the person diminishes the person's well-being, and that interferes his daily functioning. These persons will be confused in themselves. They will be easily upset. They get distracted. And they cannot care for themselves. So they become dysfunctional persons in the society. They cannot care for themselves. They get easily upset. they get easily distracted and they get easily confused. So their daily functioning gets affected because of their dysfunctional behaviors. It becomes disruptive, that diminishes their normal functioning and it interferes with their routine life. For example, addictions. Any addiction for that matter will be dysfunctional. Mainly drug addiction, alcoholics, or those who are addicted to sex addiction, drug addiction. Any addictions will make the person dysfunctional. That will interfere in his daily life. His own well-being of the person will be diminished. The abuse, that also comes under this case. The persons who are abused, persons who are neglected, persons who are experiencing a lot of phobias and fears, they cannot have a normal life. So they all will come under this category of being dysfunctional persons. So you can take that as an example. Addictions, abuse, neglect, fear, they all come under this dysfunctional person. If you are an addicted person, or if you are a person who have undergone this experience of being abused or being neglected, or the person who is having extreme fears, irrational fears or unhealthy fears, they all will come under this. They will meet this criteria of being dysfunctional. If it is a dysfunctional behavior, it will have a kind of adverse effect on the person and on the society. Since the person is struggling, naturally his contribution to the society also is affected. His way of mingling with the others will be affected. Naturally, he cannot freely relate with the others because of his dysfunctional attitude. For example, when the person is fearful of crowds, the person who is afraid of being with the others, he cannot travel in the bus because there will be big crowd. He cannot travel in the train. He cannot travel in the flight because there will be always people around. He is a loner. Being a loner who is afraid of crowds, who is afraid of people, then he may be suffering a lot in the society. He cannot have a normal functioning. That's one example for being a dysfunctional person. All the addicts, those who are addicts, those who have experienced abuse, and those who have a lot of fears, and perfectionists, they also have this problem. Some people with the extreme perfectionism, they want everything to be perfect. We deal with it later about OCD. You must have heard about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So those people also will be very dysfunctional. They cannot get along with the others because of their perfectionistic tendencies. The last criteria is danger. So if the person is a deviant, the person is experiencing distress, if he is a dysfunctional person, naturally he will become a danger for the self and for the other, hurting oneself and hurting the other. The person hurts the self and the other. Hurting the self and hurting the other. You must have heard about bipolar disorder. There are even some movies made about this. There was a famous movie called Three, a person having dual personalities. You will be in extreme depression or you will be an extreme maniac. Okay, it's called manic depression. So when he is depressed, he will have no energy to do anything. But when he goes to the manic stage, he thinks whole world is on his head. He thinks he can do anything he wants. There will be a grandiosity. He feels he is on the top of the world. That person can become very dangerous. They will go to any extreme, hurting themselves, hurting others. They don't feel any pain. Whereas when they go to the depressed stage, they will be completely without energy. They will be totally drained of energy. That is the another phase of the same person. So such persons are extremely dangerous. They will be hurting oneself, hurting the other. That is the main criteria. So they become dangerous for the society, danger for the self and danger for the society. Mainly these people are marked by carelessness. They'll be very careless, they'll be very reckless. When they get into this phase of manic phase, if they are driving, they'll be having reckless driving. They will go against the traffic. They'll, because they feel they are at the top of the world, they can do anything they want. Carelessness, poor judgment, hostility, and misinterpretation. They will misinterpret the reality. So these are the main characteristics of the person who can put themselves and others into danger. Carelessness, judgment, poor judgment, hostility and misinterpretation. Carelessness, poor judgment, hostility and misinterpretation. Misinterpretation of the reality. We shall deal with each of the disorders, then you will know how dangerous they can be. Now we are still in the theory level, so it might be a little confusing for you. When we go to the individual disorders, then all these criteria will be very clear for us. Because they are extremely careless, they will have very poor judgment, they are very hostile, and then they will have lot of misinterpretation of the reality. You remember the Jagoda's criteria, no? Accurate view of the self, accurate view of the reality, those 6 criteria. Whereas these people, those who are with manifesting this abnormal behavior, they will have misperception of the reality or the misinterpretation of the reality, and they will put themselves at risk and they also put others at risk. When the person is doing a reckless driving, if he is driving so fast and goes and hits somewhere else, the person will be dead, the other person also will be dead, or there will be damage to the property. So that kind of behavior is classified as a dangerous behavior. So now we have seen this basically four Ds proposed by DSM-5. And what is the DSM? Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, published by American Psychological Association in the year 2013, and they have given us 4 criteria, 4D criteria: deviance, distress, dysfunction and danger. If any person who meets these criteria, he can be considered or diagnosed as a person with abnormal behavior. To conclude this section, we can say none of these 4 criteria provide a satisfactory description of abnormal behavior. That is the truth. As I told earlier, none of these criteria, or even all of them put together, may not provide us a satisfactory description of a abnormal behavior. But in most of the cases, all the 4 criteria are used in diagnosing abnormality. So the psychiatrists and psychologists, they make use of all the 4 Ds in order to diagnose abnormality in the human persons, even though they may not provide a comprehensive view of the abnormality.